aunt called a family meeting at her house on a Tuesday night, announced she was transferring Grandpa's lake property to her son, and slid a quitclaim deed across the coffee table for me to sign. I smiled, looked at the notary sitting quietly in the corner, the one I had hired, and said, "I think we should read the actual will first." The smile left her face so fast it was almost beautiful. I need to back up. Grandpa passed in late October, just before the first real snowfall of the season. The kind of death that feels somehow right. A man who had spent his whole life in northern Ontario, gone just as the lakes were starting to freeze over. He was 81, and he had been sick for about 14 months, and I had been there for almost all of it. I'm a palliative care aide. People find that uncomfortable when I tell them. They say things like, "Oh, that must be so hard," and then they change the subject. What they don't realize is that it also means I know exactly what the last months of a person's life look like. I know how to read the gradual narrowing. I know how to make someone comfortable when the world is getting smaller around them. I had done it for strangers for 6 years. Doing it for my grandfather felt like the most important work I had ever done. I moved into the back bedroom of his property in Muskoka in September of the year before he died. My aunt, my father's older sister, had originally offered to take the first shift. She drove up 2 weekends in a row, complained the Wi-Fi was too slow, and then stopped answering when the home care coordinator called her. My father, who lives in Calgary and had not seen Grandpa in 4 years, sent an e-transfer for $300 in November and called it covering expenses. I didn't say anything, I just kept going. The Muskoka property had been in my grandfather's family since the early 70s. It wasn't huge, 2 acres on a quiet lake, a main cottage, a small boathouse that leaked, but to anyone who had spent a childhood summer there, it was everything. I had learned to swim off that dock. I had read every book I'd ever loved on that screened porch. My grandfather used to say the property wasn't worth anything to a stranger and priceless to anyone who understood it. He meant it. In his last clear months, he and I talked a lot in the evenings. He'd have tea, I'd have whatever I could manage to make from his pantry, and we'd sit in the living room while the lake went dark outside. He told me things I don't think he told anyone. About decisions he regretted, about the way he'd watched his children grow into people who sometimes confused love with convenience. "Your aunt is going to want the land," he said to me one night, completely out of nowhere. It was March. There was still ice on the water. She's been after it for 20 years, always talking about what she could do with it. A renovation, a rental. She sees a number, not a place. I didn't say anything because what do you say to that? "I've already spoken to my solicitor," he said. He used the word solicitor the way people of his generation did, like it was a formal title deserving of weight. "Everything is in order. I want you to know that." I nodded. I didn't ask details. It felt inappropriate, like I was angling for something. I wasn't there for the property. I was there because he was my grandfather and he was dying and someone needed to be. He died on a Thursday morning. Peacefully, which is a word that can feel meaningless when you say it and completely true when you witness it. I made the calls. I handled the immediate paperwork. I contacted the funeral home. My aunt arrived 2 days later with her husband and her son, my cousin, who is 28 and has never held a job for longer than 8 months. They stood in the cottage like they were touring a listing. My aunt was warm to me that weekend, which I should have recognized as a warning sign. She kept saying things like, "You were such a rock for him, and we couldn't have done this without you." She hugged me. She asked if I was eating enough. She called me sweetheart. The estate lawyer contacted us 3 weeks later to schedule the reading of the will. My aunt called me the night before. She said she'd been speaking to my father. They had apparently been in close contact, which was news to me, and that they both felt it made more sense to handle things informally within the family rather than going through a formal process. She said lawyers just made everything complicated. She said Grandpa would have wanted us to sort it out ourselves. I told her I'd see her at the lawyer's office in the morning. She went quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, sweetheart," in a voice that had gone about 15 degrees colder. The will was straightforward. The cottage property and the majority of the estate, which included savings and a modest investment account amounting to just over $240,000, had been left to me in trust with the specific note that the property was not to be sold for at least 5 years, and that my grandfather wished for it to remain in the family in the spirit in which it was built. My aunt received a cash bequest of $40,000. My father received $30,000. There were a few other small amounts to long-time friends. My aunt did not react the way I expected. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She just sat very still, and then she said, "He wasn't well at the end. He wasn't himself." She looked at the estate lawyer. "We may need to revisit this." The lawyer, who had been practicing in Barrie for 30 years and had clearly seen this before, said he would be happy to explain the process for contesting a will and that he should mention upfront that the will had been updated 8 months prior, during a period when my grandfather's physician had assessed him and confirmed he had full testamentary capacity. My aunt didn't respond to that. She picked up her coat and left. My father called me that evening from Calgary. I hadn't spoken to him in about 6 weeks. "She's really upset," he said. He meant my aunt. "I know," I said. "She was expecting to be included more substantially. You have to understand, the property she always assumed." "She assumed," I said. "That's not the same as being promised." He was quiet. "Then Grandpa wasn't always thinking clearly at the end. You were there all the time. You could have influenced him." I sat with that for a second. The accusation was so clean and so casual, like he'd just mentioned the weather. "I was there all the time," I said, "because I was the one taking care of him. And for what it's worth, he brought up the will himself. I never asked." "She's talking to a lawyer," my father said. "That's her right," I said, and I got off the phone. What followed was about 6 weeks of what I can only describe as a coordinated campaign. Cousins I hadn't seen since a family reunion in 2019 texted me to say they were worried about the situation. A family friend sent me a message on Facebook asking if I considered how much stress this was causing everyone. My aunt posted something vague on her Facebook about betrayal and family loyalty that everyone seemed to understand was about me, without her having to say so. My father sent me an email, not a text, an email which told me he drafted it, explaining that Grandpa had always intended for the property to be shared, that my presence there at the end had created an undue influence situation, and that they were consulting a specialist. I have to be honest, for about 2 weeks I was a wreck, not because I doubted what Grandpa had wanted. I had been there. I'd watched him sign the updated will with a steady hand and a clear mind, and a very specific reason for every decision he made. I wasn't a wreck because of guilt. I was a wreck because it is genuinely destabilizing to have your family look at the last year of your life, the hardest, loneliest, most meaningful year, and tell you that it was actually just a long con. What got me through it was a phone call with Grandpa's solicitor, a woman named Miss Chen who worked out of Barrie and had known my grandfather for a decade. She was precise and calm, and she did not waste words. She walked me through the capacity documentation. She explained that the will had been drafted with a detailed statement of reasons, precisely because my grandfather had anticipated this kind of challenge. He had told her, she said, that he knew his family. He had wanted to make it hard to argue with. "He was protecting you," she said. "He knew what he was doing." I had to put the phone down for a minute after that. The meeting my aunt called, the one I mentioned at the beginning, happened about 3 weeks after the lawyer's office. She had stopped threatening legal action, which Miss Chen told me was likely because whoever she'd spoken to had explained that the case was not strong. Instead, my aunt shifted tactics. She called a family dinner at her house in Orangeville, invited my father to dial in on video, and framed the whole thing as a chance to talk as a family. I almost didn't go. Then I decided I needed to see it through. I brought Miss Chen's paralegal, his name was Thomas, He was 26 and looked like he'd be more comfortable at a campus pub, but he had a very good memory and a folder, and my aunt didn't know who he was when we walked in. My aunt had set out a full spread: lasagna, garlic bread, a Caesar salad, the hospitality of someone who wants something. My cousin was there, eating like he hadn't had a hot meal in a week. My father's face was on a laptop at the end of the table, a little pixelated, looking uncomfortable. My aunt started with what I'd come to think of as her warmth routine, how good it was to see me, how hard this had all been on everyone, how she just wanted us to move forward as a family. Then she slid a piece of paper across the table toward me. It was a proposed amendment, informal, not legally binding, but designed to look official. It outlined a new arrangement where the Muskoka property would be transferred into a shared family trust with 4 stakeholders: her, my father, my cousin and me, with major decisions requiring a majority vote. There was a line at the bottom for my signature. I looked at it. I looked at my aunt. This would effectively transfer ownership away from what Grandpa specified, I said. It keeps it in the family, she said, smiling. That's what he wanted. He specified that I would steward it, I said. He was very clear about that. He wasn't well, she said, the smile still there, but different now, like a window with the light behind it gone. You know that. We all know that. He was lonely, and you were there, and he made a decision based on emotion rather than family legacy. My father's face on the laptop nodded. He was assessed, I said. By a doctor who saw him for 40 minutes, she said. And by his lawyer, I said, who worked with him for 10 years and documented his reasons in writing. My aunt looked at Thomas, who had been quiet and had not introduced himself. Who is this? She asked. He's with Ms. Chen's office, I said. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. My cousin stopped chewing. You brought a lawyer, my aunt said. A paralegal, I said. I wanted to make sure everything was properly understood. My aunt looked at my father's face on the laptop. Something passed between them. Some recalculation. And then she looked back at me and the warmth was completely gone. What your grandfather did was not fair, she said, and her voice had an edge now that was almost a relief after all the sweetness. I am his daughter, his only daughter. I loved that property just as much as you did. I spent summers there. I have memories there, and he gave it to you, a granddaughter who moved in at the end when it suited her. Something in me went very quiet. I moved in, I said, because he needed someone. I asked you first. I asked you directly, and you said the internet was too slow. She opened her mouth. I moved in, I continued, and I stayed for 14 months. I took 14 months of unpaid leave from my job, which I was able to do because palliative care aides do not make enough money for anyone to care if we take time off. I managed his medications, his appointments, his finances, his anxiety. I read to him when his eyes were too tired. I sat with him on the nights he was scared. And when he died, I made every single call, and I kept it together because someone had to. The table was very quiet. You sent a casserole in month 3, I said to my aunt. My dad sent $300. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because you spent the last 6 weeks telling people I manipulated a dying man, and I need you to understand that what I actually did was just show up. My aunt looked like she was about to say something and then didn't. My father's voice came through the laptop speaker, quieter than before. We weren't trying to suggest. Yes, you were, I said. Not angry, just clear. That is exactly what you were suggesting, and I understand why, because if I manipulated him, then none of you have to feel bad about where you were. It's a lot easier than the alternative. The alternative being he gave the property to me because I was there and you weren't. Thomas cleared his throat gently and set a document on the table beside my aunt's proposed amendment. It was a copy of the capacity assessment and the statement of reasons from the will file. Ms. Chen had included it at my request. This is the full documentation of your father's testamentary capacity assessment and his written statement of intent, he said. Any legal challenge would need to address this directly. I just want to make sure everyone has a chance to review it. My aunt didn't pick it up. My cousin looked at the lasagna. My father's face on the laptop was very still. I had thought I would feel more in that moment. Triumph, maybe, or grief, or relief. What I actually felt was tired. Deeply, structurally tired. The kind that doesn't go away after a good night's sleep. I had spent 14 months pouring myself into something real and true, and then 6 weeks defending it from people who should have been grateful and weren't. "I'm not signing anything," I said. "The estate will be administered as Grandpa specified. Miss Chen's office will handle it. If you want to contest formally, that's your right, but I'd encourage you to read that documentation first." I stood up. Thomas stood up. I put my jacket on. "The property is not going to be sold or rented," I said at the door. "It's going to be maintained, and it's going to stay in the family." That's what he wanted. That's what I'm going to do. If at some point you want to visit, you're welcome to ask. My aunt didn't say anything. My cousin said, "See ya," without looking up, which almost made me laugh. The drive back to Muskoka was about 90 minutes. It was dark by the time I got there, and the temperature had dropped, and there was a skin of ice starting to form on the edges of the lake. I sat on the porch for a while with the lights off, just watching it. The formal challenge never came. Miss Chen told me 2 weeks later that my aunt had consulted an estates lawyer in Guelph who had apparently told her the case was not viable, given the documentation. The $40,000 bequest was accepted without further comment. My father called me around Christmas and we had a short, careful conversation that didn't go anywhere in particular. It wasn't hostile. It also wasn't much. My cousin, of all people, texted me in the spring. He said he was sorry for how things had gone. He said he hadn't understood the full picture and that he'd felt weird about the whole thing for months. He asked if the offer to visit still stood. I said yes. He came up in July with a girlfriend, and they were both actually quite decent company. We took the canoe out to the far end of the lake, and he didn't complain once about the Wi-Fi. The boathouse still leaks. I'm saving up to have it properly repaired rather than just patched, the way Grandpa always said he was going to do and never quite got around to. The screened porch has new furniture, nothing expensive, just comfortable. I started working part-time again at a hospice in Gravenhurst, 3 days a week, which feels like the right amount for now. The investment account paid off the 2 years of interest I'd accrued on my student loans. The rest I'm sitting with carefully, the way you hold something you were trusted with rather than something you were just handed. There's a photo on the mantel of Grandpa on the dock in probably 1987, young and squinting into the sun. I look at it sometimes when I'm making tea in the evening and the lake is going quiet and the whole place smells like cedar and wood smoke, and I think, he knew exactly what he was doing. He just needed someone to hold the line until it was over. I held it. There's something I keep coming back to. Sitting on that porch in the evenings when the lake goes quiet. My grandfather knew. He knew his daughter would push. He knew his son would go along with it from a safe distance in Calgary. He knew that the person who actually showed up would be the person who got questioned for it. And he prepared anyway, quietly, carefully, without telling me, because that's what integrity actually looks like when it's real. Not announced, just done. I used to think the hardest part of that year was the physical exhaustion. The 3 a.m. wake-ups, the medication schedules, the learning to stay calm when someone you love doesn't recognize you for a moment. But the harder thing, I know now, was the 6 weeks after. Because the work of caregiving at least had a clear shape to it. The accusations didn't. There's no protocol for your father suggesting, gently, over the phone, that your presence at someone's deathbed was actually a long-running manipulation. You just have to sit with that and decide what you know to be true. What I knew was this. I had never asked my grandfather about the will. Not once. It hadn't occurred to me. I was there because he was family, and he needed someone, and I was the one who could go. That's it. That's the whole story. And when my aunt slid that document across the table with her best approximation of warmth, The lasagna, the careful phrasing, the framing of theft as togetherness. I wasn't angry exactly. I was just clear. Clarity is a thing you earn. It doesn't arrive on its own. You build it slowly, by doing the right thing in small moments over a long time, until eventually you know your own mind well enough that no one can talk you out of it in a dining room in Orangeville. Miss Chen told me once that the reason my grandfather's will was so difficult to contest wasn't just the legal documentation, it was the statement of reasons. He had written in his own words why he was making the choices he made. He had named the things he'd observed. He had been honest about his family in a way that must have cost him something to put on paper. That took a kind of clear-eyed courage I find myself thinking about more than anything else from that whole period. He was 81 and dying, and he still chose honesty over comfort. I want to be that kind of person. Thomas, the paralegal, was 26 and looked slightly terrified the entire drive to Orangeville. On the way back he said, "You were really calm in there." I told him I'd been practicing being calm for about 14 months. What I didn't say was that calm isn't the absence of feeling, it's just the decision to think before you speak, every single time, even when every part of you wants to overturn the lasagna. That's not a talent, it's a choice you make over and over, until it becomes the way you move through things. My cousin texted me in the spring and came up in July and we were fine. That surprised me more than anything. People are capable of more than the worst version of themselves if you give them a little time and don't close the door completely. I think about that too, the difference between a boundary and a wall. Grandpa left me the property, but he also left me that distinction, somewhere in those long evening conversations, in all the things he said about his family without bitterness, just with clear eyes. I held the line because he trusted me to, and because I knew what I'd done to earn it. Not everyone will see that. Not everyone needs to.